Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to the organizers and the ORF team for having us here for 2 excellent days of programming. We're starting day 2 with this plenary discussion on scripting the post-2030 agenda, and I'm joined by a very distinguished group of panelists. As we sort of look at before we dive straight into the post-2030 agenda, I thought maybe let's just take stock of where we are with the global goals as they currently stand. And what we've seen, let's say, over the last 4 years or so is a series of mutually reinforcing shocks, whether it's been the pandemic, whether it's been geopolitical crises, whether it's been the cost of living crisis, whether it's been the cycle of interest rates, and other issues. But if we look at also, let's say, the recovery perhaps from the pandemic, and what the pandemic firstly really exposed was systemic vulnerabilities that exist in our systems, in our economies, and in our societies. And the recovery from that process has been fairly uneven as well. We've seen countries that have been spending a lot more to cushion, to cushion their economies. They've also been taking on a lot of debt to finance all of that spending, which has also led to a deterioration of public financing systems in low and middle income countries. And I think as we sort of look at every convening, every few months, like this one and perhaps the next edition, one will see a report on the SDG financing gap, where the SDG financing gap is ever widening. It was 2.5 trillion before the pandemic. It's about 4 trillion each year now. And so I think all of that sort of gives the point that perhaps the global goals are always out of reach. In the Asia Pacific, as of last year, just 17% of the global goals were on track. And it was projected that by 2030, we would miss at least 2/3 of the goals and their underlying indicators. So I think all of this gives us sort of pause for reflection and consideration. And I think as part of our sort of conversation today, and we've broken it into 2 sort of themes or segments of discussion. The first on sort of the learnings from the SDG implementation thus far, and what is it that could sort of help shape priorities for the post-2030 agenda. And the second sort of segment of discussion around avenues of collaboration and building these alliances of the future. There have been a lot of criticisms of the global goals as they currently stand. There have been points around how indigenous knowledge is not incorporated and reflected in the global goals, particularly as we talk about South-South cooperation to the extent that we do. There's criticism that the global goals are not really set from a whole of systems perspective, in the sense that the private sector has not really embraced these global goals. And also the architecture around it, that these are 21st century ambitions for human and societal development and economic development that are supported by 20th century legacy institutions. So I think we'll sort of reflect on all of that as we move in. And perhaps to sort of start us off, I'll come to Joeita first, because I'm trying to bookend each segment with the island states. If you could sort of reflect on Malaysia's progress around the SDGs and what you think will shape the post-2030 agenda.
Thank you so much for that loaded question. It's a very difficult one to answer within 30 seconds, but let me take this opportunity to thank the organizer for inviting me. It's great to be back in Colombo after such a long time. For Malaysia, I'm happy to report that we made some progress in 2024 with about 43% of the SDG targets being achieved by Malaysia. So again, it was stated that this would be about 17% higher based on global average of SDG targets. But I'm not here to talk about how well we've ticked the boxes. I'm here to also share with you that even though it's great that we're monitoring the progress of SDG targets, on the ground, when we look at statistics and data based on districts, based on states, we do have a lot of work to do. Let me go first and share with you about our poverty rate in Malaysia. We've had a lot of achievements in eradicating hardcore poverty levels, and by 2022, the proportion of households living in hardcore poverty would be just at under 0.5%. So it would be about 18,445 households from about a population of 32 million. On the downside, while we have eradicated hardcore poverty, we did see that absolute poverty numbers have actually increased, especially after the pandemic. And it was recorded 2 years ago to stand at about 6.2%, which was an increase of 1.5% from the year before. We do have also an issue when it comes to dropout rates among primary school students as well as high school students. And in 2020, this was the year of the pandemic, about 21,748 students dropped out at both the primary and secondary schools. On wages, we've also seen stagnant wage growth. A study found that in the past 30 years, annual salary increase was capped at 56 ringgit, which is just a bit more than $12 per year on average. So with all these discrepancies on the ground, what I found to be empowering and also a bit motivating is the role of non-government stakeholders or non-government NGOs, as well as activists, as well as experts and academia in actually trying to provide micro-solution programs for vulnerable communities. So I've been very much active in the policy space in think tanks, but let me tell you, I've never been more motivated when I was working with the communities themselves. I think at the end of the day, when you do want to reach the SDG targets, you have to go back to the grassroots. You have to go back to the communities, and this will only be successful when you see the grassroots and communities voicing out what their priorities are. And the work that I'm doing with ABPHGM SDG in Malaysia is trying to figure out those priorities with member of parliaments and then craft micro-solution programs for these communities. A case in point would be on the marginalized students of an indigenous tribe, the Temya tribe, where again, school attendance is quite low and dropout rates are very high in both primary and also secondary schools. But with the right program, we were able to train and also encourage primary and also secondary Temya students to excel in robotics programs and also in robotics competition. So what I'm trying to emphasize here is that with the right resource, and it's not just financial resource, but also with the right amount of training, any community can thrive. So my 2 cents would be that, yes, when the government craft the policies, they do need partners on the ground to be able to interpret as well as to make those policies digestible and implementable at the on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Charita, for that overview and noting your points also on sort of going back to communities and grassroots and I think on that note maybe we'll bring in Azau Maka as well. That based on your experience, what perhaps need to be the priorities post 2030?
One priority post-2030 is a just and equal transition to green economy. More often than not, island states and elsewhere in the world make commitments, but the intention never carries everyone along. I think it's important for island states to make a commitment that no woman, no physically disadvantaged person, no youth, no man is left behind, that everyone is carried along and the digital divide is also bridged. Yesterday, the advisor to the president mentioned that Sri Lanka is going to be an island of excellence. I think a huge component of excellence is that priority that ensures that the transition to a green economy is just and fair. More importantly, on sustainable farming practices, but also on a circular economy where there are no wastes, purposes are reused, and value is added along the chain. I think these are great ideas for priority number one to ensure that island communities have a just and fair transition to green economy. Thanks, Karan.
And thank you. And I think both of you have highlighted in your own way, Joita, on sort of robotics and the digital ecosystem. And I note here as well that Osamaka mentions the importance of sort of building on that digital ecosystem. And we heard from the president yesterday as well. So Andre, maybe, coming to you in terms of the fact that Slovenia, ranks ninth on the SDGs as they currently stand. And it also has a very strong sort of digital ecosystem there as well. What have been some of those learnings that you've had thus far, and how do you see that sort of informing where we go next?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. It's a big pleasure to be here in Colombo. Yes, I will speak maybe on behalf of Slovenia and maybe something from a European perspective, of course. I was firstly pleasantly surprised when I saw that Slovenia was ranked ninth out of 165 countries on the, let's say, realization of SDG. But of course, if then you take time, you read through this, and you see that on a global level there are huge differences, great gaps between continents and great countries, and something that we in Slovenia think it's quite normal is in some other countries hard to reach or hard to get. So I think that we should rethink for the future our global goals, because for some countries, even if some countries don't work on some priorities, they will reach them, and on the other hand, other countries will really work a lot, and they will not be able to reach it because it's impossible. So we have to talk maybe something about global solidarity in that case. And of course, for Slovenia, of course, we are a small country, 2 million people. Some goals like no poverty, quality education. We are quite a welfare state, and even if you don't work in Slovenia, with our social support and such things, you can get through the month quite okay, I think. And education, primary school is mandatory. is obligation by law, and even you can get a master degree for free in our country. You can even take another class of it for free, and that's quite, I think, accessible and reachable for our standards. Political stability also, of course, I think it's quite well organized, the system. And if I look a bit maybe from a European perspective and what's going to happen in the future, maybe I, in my perspective, would demand or ask for more regional cooperation, regional development. Of course, also green transition. Maybe, okay, we had now elections in the United States. Now on Sunday there will be elections in Germany. But I think a lot of people will have a great headache. But you get that if you keep ignoring people, or you say, I am listening to you, but I can't hear you, such a things. So that's then quite a logical consequence. And maybe now in a short term, green ideas, renewable sustainability will not be so high on agenda, but on a long term, I think definitely it will be number one priority, of course. So from that point of perspective, even I, when I was working at the Ministry for Economical Development Technology, I always said we support sustainability. We have a lot of funds to fund that in European mechanisms. Of course, we support that, but we support green ideas, green technology, but not green multi-capitalism, right? Because not everything that is selling green is green. So we will have to rethink also what is green and what is not green. And for the future priorities, I would say, of course, as I mentioned before, social cohesion, regional development, rethinking of global values and priorities, global solidarity, I think, and of course, I think public health. Health is one issue that we are not talking about, and even if we saw that from other countries, that's going to be a very important question for the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre, for those reflections, and including on some of those points around which seem much more basic, which I think we should have got to 10 years into the SDGs, around defining what is green, defining, at least being clear and being on the same page in terms of how we refer to different aspects and changes. And perhaps that's a good note to bring Sarah into the sort of conversation as well, to sort of reflect on these sustainability challenges for island states, not just in the context of green and the environment, but also in the context of the sustainability of our workforce. How do we make them sort of future ready? The sustainability of island states as economies as well. So, Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, let me place on record my thanks for being invited to be on this panel. I think in the first instance, the point about going out and consulting the grassroots and getting their information and their advice or their inputs is tremendously important. But I think there's another dimension to it, and that is the grassroots too need their awareness raised, their capacity raised in understanding what this is all about. Because I would wager a bet that not many people know what SDGs are, and they have to be, their capacity has to be built up to understand what we are talking about. The second thing is that, we governments can go and sign international agreements and all of that and commit to a variety of good objectives, but there must be a way in which they are proactively incorporated in policy. For example, when it comes to development projects, we need to make sure that there are environmental impact assessments that are mandatory and they are not ignored. Because, they tick a box and say we did an EIA, but its incorporation into policy is often forgotten and goes by the way. That's tremendously important because we have had situations in Sri Lanka where this has happened, and it has led to very debilitating consequences. The third point with regard to, island states and regional cooperation and all of that is this, is that, look, environmental issues pose a challenge of a very different nature in that they are not bound by national boundaries.
Yeah.
National sovereignty, therefore, has to be looked at from a different perspective in terms of getting together, collaborating in order to deal with this. In the South Asian region, we have multilateral associations like SAARC. We have the Indian Ocean Region Association. We have BIMSTEC. We have a number of organizations, but quite frankly, they don't do very much at all. They're organizations in name. They don't do very much for regional solidarity. And yes, in the South Asian context, we do have a particular characteristic, I think, which is absent from any other region, and that is that India, by far, is the largest, the richest, the most powerful country in the region, and every single other member of that region has a bilateral issue with India, which India says must not be brought to a multilateral forum. So that is an issue that we have to resolve. But I think, when we look into 2030, which is only 5 years away, we also have to take into account a number of other facts. I mean, some of our economies are aging economies. Some of our economies are going to be hit by the onset of AI, artificial intelligence. Consequently, the employment situation in our countries is going to have to change. Do we have to think in terms of a government giving some kind of universal pay to everyone so that they can have food, clothing, and shelter? Or are we saying, look, no, we throw it to the private sector. Let's see what they come up with. Thirdly, I mean, this is the case in Sri Lanka, and I'm sure it is the case perhaps in other countries as well. There is an increase in the female population as opposed to the male population. I think here in Sri Lanka, it's 52% female, 48% male. What are the consequences of that? How do we work a public health system which was basically dealt to deal with the challenge of baby boomers? But now we have to deal with an aging population. We have to shift our resources. So, there are a number of challenges which are going to come about in the next 5 to 10 years, or even faster, because of the pace of technology, which governments do not seem to be aware of, or if aware of, they haven't a clue in how to deal with them. And this is the point, is that, instead of firefighting and fixing the day-to-day problems or the annual problems, the solutions to them should be located within a broader development strategy, so that we are not just dealing with it as an isolated, siloed case, but in terms of a broader development strategy.
Right. No, thanks, Sarah. There's a lot in there to reflect on, and I think I'm going to come back specifically on the question of sort of reimagining these mechanisms of cooperation and collaboration, including the point that you just sort of ended on, which is also, I think, really important. We see that certainly in larger economies and in contexts of different sort of line departments and ministries and others sort of working in silos. In fact, one will also see that the same sort of piece of work has been sort of commissioned and looked at by two different agencies at the same time, with two sorts of very different approaches as well. So how do we sort of bring some of that together? I think one of the points that you also mentioned was around sort of resourcing for the global goals, and maybe I'll connect that point to private sector, but perhaps more specifically to financing, and bring Joeita into that. That there is this sort of great divide when it comes to financial resources currently between global north, global south. sort of countries, there is a sort of a dependency that exists. But at the same time, these commitments around sort of financing that enable us to get to these global goals, I think those firm commitments continue to be evasive. Right? We currently have the Financing for Development Forum that's ongoing at the UN as well. We've seen various G20 declarations. We saw the COP as well, right, where there was considerable sort of debate on financing. So how is it that that sort of factors into this piece, and how is it that we can sort of look to sort of enhancing collaboration and coordination to plug that particular gap?
Thank you for that question. It's, I think, a coincidence maybe that I'm currently working with UNCTAD on creating an Asian green development framework. So again, please allow me to brainstorm my ideas here and also to get your feedback as well on what Asia would need when it comes to shared green development. We do see international treaties like Paris Agreement and also COP29 at a very global scale. And that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have national policies on renewable energy or energy transition being implemented by different countries in Asia. What is lacking here is a network that is very region specific. So this is where a collaboration, a cooperation of a non-binding framework would actually help Asian countries to bridge the aspirations or the targets of our international treaties with our ongoing efforts on the ground. So the framework or the network that I was thinking of would have two components, which is track 1 and also track 2 networks. This is where the pillars of research, as well as advocacy and awareness, technical building and training, and the last pillar would be on program implementation. These pillars would be very, very important in helping Asian countries to achieve their green development agendas. I think at this point in time, as much as we would like to see greater aid coming from the West when it comes to combating climate crisis, it is very evident that we shouldn't be 100% dependent on these aids because, again, in the COP29 last year, the allocation that was expected was much higher than what was actually offered. So I think this is where Asian countries can come together. I do understand that different Asian countries have different levels of development, hence different amounts of funding when it comes to green development. But it goes beyond financial aid. What is important in this region is, again, awareness of the issues of green development. And also I feel that technical assistance and also sharing of best practices would also play key roles in Asian countries like Sri Lanka, like Malaysia, to achieve their green energy aspirations. So within this framework, we will not be excluding our partners in the West, while the member countries are made up of Asian countries. I envision that this cooperation would also include observer countries from many parts of the world, including the West. So I'll stop there, and hopefully I can get your input later on what kind of framework you think Asia should have. Thank you.
Thanks, Rita. As you're sort of talking about a framework, and I will, as someone who also works on so many of those, I'll say yet another one, right? So how do we also sort of ensure that not only do we have a tacit sort of buy-in, but that these frameworks also have these resources that you just referenced put behind them, and tangible commitments, at least from the countries, our global South countries, to whatever extent possible. But connecting to that thread of climate action, but also, the point, Zaumaka, that you made earlier around the need for just, equitable transitions. What are the ways to sort of build resilience in local communities, and what is the role of a sort of collaboration and philanthropies and other actors in the ecosystem as we try to do that?
Thank you, Karan. Well, never forget the people. The people in those island communities are the ones that are most affected. They are the ones that will make it work. Yesterday, His Excellency the President made mention to the robust architectural framework that is going to support social safety nets in Sri Lanka and hopefully the other island communities. It is really important that the people themselves are allowed to develop indigenous early warning systems for disaster management and resilience. It is important that they are at the center of policy conversations, so be it formulation, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. They have to be at the center of it all. It has to be community initiated. It has to be community driven. That is the only way anything has ever worked in the world. And island communities will not be an exception. I know that they will be able to achieve this if they come together as a team with respect, with dignity, and with integrity to better achieve environmental resilience. A second component to that is the support that has to be from all of us. So I speak to a room of powerful people today that are influential. So whenever you're on a table and someone from an island community is not there, you are the voice for those people, and you must speak truth to power. I think this is how we can better serve the island communities as supporters, but as change champions. So speak truth to power when you're on that table that other people without voices are being misrepresented. Thanks, Karan.
Thank you. That's so well put. Andre, maybe to just quickly bring you in to sort of reflect on that point of sort of building these alliances for the future. But again, perhaps possibly, in the context of environmental sustainability and others, the role of sort of tech in there as well, if you want to sort of quickly reflect on that.
Yes, if you want to plan for the future and for, let's say, that will be green, that will be prosperous, and that will be in social cohesion, let's say, we are in urgent need to include also young people. From my point of view, I went into the politics very young, since middle school, and went up, went down, went up, and so on. You know how it goes in politics. And the values that's changed between young people now are concerning for me, because sometimes, well, if I remember or look 10 years back, when we had a meeting or a conference, of course we went after for a beer or two, there were 50 people that came, And 2 weeks ago, I was invited for one reunion or alumni of that former organization, and there were 4 people. So participation of young people, I think, is in urgent need. Also, a lot of continents, especially Europe, is aging. That is putting a lot of pressure on not only environment, also public finances, and also planning the politics. And when I finished my PhD year and a half ago, I wanted to, of course, I had to read all the literature in the world, studies, so on. And the first and most important people, when including people, young people, and inviting them to participate, of course, we have to offer them some mechanisms so they can participate. Let's say digital, like in Slovenia, you know, you have digital identity, and you can order you for a medical appointment. You can sign check. You can, let's say, change your name. You can participate in public affairs legislation. You can comment it and so on. That's very important. And of course, if we want to address and include young people, we have to not only be present in the cities, like, okay, you know, we have two big cities, but also we have to go in the rural area to the areas that are not so developed, and also take care for regional development, and that everybody, if you know, if I live not in a capital, outside of capital, or somewhere near a border of my country, I deserve and I need same public infrastructure and the model of participation like somebody that's in capital. I think we have, at least in Europe, we have to start thinking from that, and for the plan for the future, of course, with young. Not only that, now the future will be planned by the people aged 60 plus, with all due respect, but we also have to include people aged, let's say, 15 on. Thank you.
No, thanks, Andre, and maybe Sarah, let me come back to you for like the sort of the final question on, you know, where we sort of left off earlier, which was sort of revitalizing these existing mechanisms of cooperation, whether they're regional, whether they're global, but also perhaps national, right? And what, to your mind, really needs to be done to sort of reinvigorate these systems and mechanisms of cooperation?
You know, in the next 5 years, we will have a Trump administration in Washington, which will be wreaking havoc, as far as I'm concerned, with regard to international trade, the international economy. Now, making America great again is, I think, a backlash against globalization. It is about bringing jobs back to America, etc. Now, in the global South, what is the perspective as far as that's concerned? We did benefit from globalization, but at the same time, politically, there are forces within all of our countries that are talking about a loss of economic sovereignty, a loss of national sovereignty, because not just multinationals, but big states are coming to gobble us up, as it were. So I think for the global South, and not just island communities, but also landlocked states, we have to sit down and come to a consensus as to how we deal with a world in turmoil as a consequence of what's happened in the United States. We have to come to a consensus of, are we going to stand as the defenders of globalization, or are we going to join that sort of, national, almost mercantilist notion of how the economies of the world should run? So what we're talking about, I think, is essentially a basic paradigm shift. We have allowed ourselves to have our futures, our policies, etc., to be determined by that consensus of NATO in terms of military security and all of that, and the Bretton Woods institutions as far as economic security is concerned. Now it is a time for change. And I'm not quite sure as to who is going to bring about that change. But I certainly do know that if it is to happen in the global South, it certainly would give a great fillip to the notion of the global South coming up with a different perspective rather than paying lip service to the existing perspective and suffering as a consequence. I mean, a classic example is Sri Lanka, where there are sections of our polity who are deeply critical of the government because it said it's sold out to the IMF. But they said that they were going to renegotiate the terms of a deal and all of that, but none of that happened. Because they decided that political stability was more important than any of that. So I think the Global South really has to come together. We need leaders, thought leaders as well as policy leaders in the Global South who would come out and define a new perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And I think perhaps that brings us to the point of just sort of wrapping our first plenary for the day, because I've sort of got the signal that we need to move to our second because we're running a bit behind. But maybe just a quick reflection on what we've sort of heard so far. I think the fact that a lot of what we've sort of mentioned is also overlapping. A number of us have spoken about digital, we've spoken about aging populations, we've spoken about the grassroots and bringing in community voices, and really sort of also building capacities and co-shaping the agenda rather than someone sort of setting a post-2030 agenda for those that are most vulnerable without them having a voice at the table. But I think what it also sort of highlights is the need for these transformative actions. And if we were to look at the post-2030 agenda almost as a sort of a Rubik's Cube, where you can't solve for one side without also solving for the others, that perhaps the enablers to help us achieve those global goals also need to be goals unto themselves. Whether it's building resilience, whether it's transitions, whether it's in the context of financing. So I think that there's or whether it's in the context of sort of relooking at these mechanisms of cooperation and reforms. So perhaps I think that is, at least for me, one of those, sort of the key message and the takeaway from our discussion this morning. But I think also to just highlight the unprecedented opportunity that we also have ahead of us to sort of help shape the global goals, bring in the voices of the Global South, and make them sort of realistic and achievable at the same time. But with that, I'd like to thank this excellent group of panelists, and if we could please have a round of applause for them as well. Thank you.